I've talked before on this channel about how I think the big distinction between fantasy and science fiction is chiefly one of worldview, or as I call it, the mode. In fantasy, you tend to have a worldview that is anywhere between pre-modern and modern. And in science fiction, you have a worldview that is anywhere from modern to postmodern. And every now and then I come across a book or an example of the pre-modern worldview, something from that worldview, that I think is a really good thing to study if you want to get more into the mindset of the pre-modern worldview, to imbue your own pre-modern world, your own fantasy world, with a little bit more of that spirit. But the funny thing about the book I'm going to talk about today is that it has, from what I've seen, at least as much to offer someone who's working in the modern to postmodern worldview as well. And the book is called Hagiography, or Urn Burial, and it was written by an Englishman named Thomas Browne, who is best described as a polymath. He was originally trained as a physician, and he also wrote about a tremendous range of other subjects during his lifetime. He lived from 1605 to 1682. He died on his 77th birthday. And Urn Burial is one of the most famous of his works. It's certainly one of the most regularly cited and quoted, because there are some wonderful, wonderful passages in it. That's the first thing that I really want to zoom in on with this particular book, is that it's written in this English style, a Shakespearean English, an Elizabethan English, that I would not say is designed to call attention to its own floweriness or anything like that, because that's not the mindset that was being used at the time that these things were written. This was just the mode that you used when you wanted to be persuasive and convincing and also beautiful at the same time. And he wrote the book in 1658, and it was inspired by a discovery at the time in Norfolk of a number of urns that were designed to contain cremains, basically human remains after cremation. And then he uses this as a jumping off point, a springboard, to talk about all the different funerary customs from ancient times all the way up to their own era. And he uses this, again, as a way to talk in general about our attitude towards death. And in that respect, it's a little bit like one of those essays that you might read in, a long-form essay in the New Yorker or something like that, where the author will start with some, fairly specific real-world subject, and then use that to go outwards from it and talk more generally about human nature. But Urn Burial is one of the earlier examples of this in English that I can think of, and certainly one of the best. It's held up to this day as being a wonderful example of how a specific real-world discussion can become a more general philosophical one. Now, reading the work itself is probably going to be a bit of a challenge, because, again, it's written in this very Elizabethan, Shakespearean kind of English with a lot of cultural references that will require you to do some looking up. Basically, if you've already made it through somebody like Dante, for instance, or again, Shakespeare, you'll probably have a lot less trouble with Urn Burial than you would with some other texts. But to that end, I would recommend reading a version of it that is annotated in some way. In the description for the video, I'm going to link to an electronic online version that has been maintained with a fair amount of annotation, some of which was in the original book and some of which has been added after the fact to explain references that many of us might not get. But you can always look stuff up. But I think the best way to convey the flavor of the discussion, the way that he talks about the subject, is to give you a couple of extended quotes from it. And these are all from the very last segment of the book, where he's basically summing up his argument. And his argument basically amounts to this: the more we strive to make ourselves important after death by way of, say, a grand tomb or a great funerary rite, the more it seems in vain. And let me give you what he says about this in his words so you can hear for yourself. He says, "There is nothing strictly immortal but immortality. What other hath no beginning may be confident of no end. All others have a dependent being, and within the reach of destruction, which is the peculiar of that necessary essence that cannot destroy itself, and the highest strain of omnipotency to be so powerfully constituted as not to suffer even from the power of itself. But the sufficiency of Christian immortality frustrates all earthly glory, and the quality of either state after death makes a folly of posthumous memory. God, who can only destroy our souls, and hath assured our resurrection, either of our bodies or names, hath directly promised no duration. Wherein there is so much chance that the boldest expectants have found unhappy frustration, and to hold long subsistence seems but escape in oblivion. But man is a noble animal, splendid in ashes and pompous in the grave, solemnizing nativities and deaths with equal luster, nor omitting ceremonies of bravery in the infamy of his nature. Life is a pure flame, and we live by an invisible sun within us. And then there's the very last paragraph, which has many of the same kinds of sentiments expressed in the same wonderful and accultured language. To subsist in lasting monuments, meaning graves, to live in their productions, to exist in their names, and predicament of chimeras, was large satisfaction unto old expectations, and made one part of their Elysiums. But all of this is nothing in the metaphysics of true belief. To live indeed is to be again ourselves, which being not only an hope, but an evidence in noble believers. 'Tis all one to lie in St. Innocent's churchyard, as in the sands of Egypt, ready to be anything in the ecstasy of being ever, and as content with 6 foot, a small grave, as the moles of Adrianus, a large one. And that last bit right there, ready to be anything in the ecstasy of being ever, the way I interpret that is, it's a miracle at all to even exist, and that to have to die just seems like part of the price of that. So you should cherish the life that you do have and not think so much about the fact that you're going to die. We're all going to die. And at the end of that, when we finally have nothing but our remains, they all end up being the same anyway. So, the tenor of the discussion that he brings to this eventually starts to become that much more existential and maybe even absurdist. And that's why I thought this seems like a work that would seem to provide a flavor, not only to those working in a pre-modern context, but in a modern to postmodern one too. And again, there's that language. And that's going to be a challenge, again, for anyone who's coming into this cold. So I don't recommend this if you haven't already had some exposure to this particular mode of 17th century English. It's going to be a little bit rough going. But I do recommend it as a way to get a flavor for, not only for the references. I'm not saying that you'd have to imitate the references, that you would have to use references in a similar way, or that you would have to you would have to have grammar that flowery, but rather as a way to look at the way that things like the arguments are constructed, that are constructed out of metaphor and out of almost musical language. When you read this out loud, as I was doing before, and I confess not doing a very good job of it, there is a musicality to the argument that he makes. Just hearing the words, just hearing the cadence, really brings home the flavor of what he's trying to say. And it's melancholy, but at the same time liberating. His idea is that he wants to liberate you from the idea that you have to be anything after your death, that you have to be that you have to leave behind something grand. The vast majority of us never will anyway. And whether or not you agree with that, the whole point is to have an experience with the way that he makes the argument, the flavor of the argument, the tone and the texture of it, the language, the way that he starts from these very particular details about burial and builds on them to larger and larger and more general observations. That's why this is worth having that encounter with. So once again, the author is Sir Thomas Browne. The book is called Urn Burial, and there are a number of paper editions of it. I have one that was printed fairly recently by New Directions. It's a very small volume, and it does not contain any contemporary annotation, although it does contain a preface by W.G. Sebald, which is very nice. And his writing comes very close to Thomas Browne in its musicality, even in translation. And as I mentioned, there is at least one electronic version of it. I'm going to link to my favorite one down in the description, which has a number of notes. And those notes are both Thomas Browne's own notes from the original edition of the book and also some more contemporary ones to give you context and insight. So have an experience with this. See what you think.